Alex loved buses. Not just riding them, but everything about them. The way they smelled, a mix of old vinyl and exhaust, the different colored seats, the little bell that rang when you pulled the cord. He knew all the bus routes in his city, even the express ones that only ran during rush hour. He could tell you the make and model of almost any bus just by looking at it. But today wasn't about buses. Today was about the ceremonial march. His mom had explained it was a very important event, a display of respect and tradition. She'd shown him pictures of the guards in their tall hats and shiny boots. He'd watched videos of them marching in perfect lines. Alex wasn't particularly interested in the military aspect, but he was fascinated by the precision, the order, the predictability. He liked things to be in their place, to follow a pattern. It made him feel safe. Alex also had autism. This meant that sometimes the world felt too loud, too bright, too much. Certain sounds, like sudden loud noises or lots of people talking at once, could be really overwhelming. He also didn't always understand social cues, like when someone was being sarcastic or when it was his turn to talk. His parents worked hard to help him navigate these challenges, but it wasn't always easy. His parents, Sarah and Tom, were incredibly supportive. They understood Alex's need for routine and predictability. They always made sure to prepare him for new experiences, explaining what to expect and answering his many questions. They knew that the ceremonial march could be a challenge for Alex, but they also knew how much he enjoyed observing patterns and order. They hoped that the structured nature of the event would appeal to him. They packed his favorite noise-canceling headphones, just in case, and promised him an extra-long bus ride home afterward, no matter what. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Excited, buddy?" she asked. Alex nodded, his eyes wide with anticipation. He clutched his small, well-worn toy bus in his other hand. Today was going to be a good day, he hoped. The closer they got to the parade route, the bigger the crowd became. Alex squeezed his mom's hand tighter. He usually didn't mind crowds too much, especially if he knew what to expect. But this was different. This was a sea of faces, all talking at once. A jumble of different smells: popcorn, hot dogs, perfume. It was a lot to take in. Street vendors hawked souvenirs, their voices booming through megaphones. A marching band practiced nearby, their brass instruments blaring out a disjointed melody. A balloon artist twisted colorful creations, each pop of the balloon a small explosion of sound. Alex felt a knot forming in his stomach. Sarah noticed Alex's unease. "Remember what we talked about, sweetie?" she said softly, bending down to his level. "If it gets too loud, you can put on your headphones. And if you need a break, we can find a quiet spot. Okay?" Tom pointed to a large oak tree a little further down the street. "We can stand under that tree," he suggested. "It's a little bit away from the main crowd, and it'll give us some shade." They made their way toward the tree, carefully navigating through the throng of people. Alex kept his eyes fixed on the ground, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. He could feel his heart beating faster and faster. Finally, they reached the oak tree. It was a little quieter there, just as Tom had promised. Alex leaned against the trunk, taking a deep breath. The shade felt cool and comforting. He watched as more and more people streamed past, all eager to find the perfect viewing spot. The excitement in the air was palpable. He could see the anticipation on his parents' faces, too. They were trying to be calm and reassuring, but he could tell they were also looking forward to the march. He didn't want to disappoint them. He wanted to be brave and enjoy the experience just like they did. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his toy bus, turning it over and over in his hands. The familiar weight and shape grounded him, reminding him of the comfort and predictability he found in his favorite thing. He took another deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and tried to focus on the feeling of the smooth plastic in his hand. He could do this. He just needed to remember to breathe. The first sounds of the march reached them as a distant rumble, like a far-off thunderstorm. Alex felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with apprehension. The rumble grew louder, transforming into the distinct beat of drums and the sharp, clear notes of trumpets. The crowd around them surged forward, eager to get a better view. Then they appeared. The guards marched in perfect unison, their tall bearskin hats bobbing in time with their steps. Their uniforms were immaculate, a dazzling display of red and gold. Sunlight glinted off their polished boots and the silver buttons on their jackets. It was an impressive sight, a spectacle of order and precision. Alex was mesmerized. The rhythmic stomping of the guards' boots, the synchronized movements of their arms, the unwavering gaze in their eyes. It was exactly the kind of pattern and order he craved. He forgot about the noise, the crowd, the anxiety that had been building inside him. He was completely absorbed in the spectacle. For a few glorious minutes, everything was perfect. He watched, transfixed, as the guards marched past, their faces stoic and unwavering. He pointed out the details to his parents, the way the light reflected off the instruments, the precise angle of their rifles, the way their hats stayed perfectly still even as they moved. But then, the music grew louder, more intense. The drums pounded in his chest, the trumpets blared in his ears. The crowd roared its approval, their voices a cacophony of sound. The colors seemed to vibrate, the movements became too fast, too overwhelming. Alex felt his carefully constructed calm begin to crumble. The world started to spin. The sounds blurred together into a deafening roar. He squeezed his eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise was inside his head, pounding against his skull. He opened his mouth and let out a scream. It was a raw, piercing sound, filled with fear and frustration. It was a scream that cut through the noise of the crowd, a scream that demanded attention. It was a scream that Alex couldn't control. The scream hung in the air, a stark contrast to the pomp and circumstance of the march. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The joyful atmosphere was instantly replaced with a palpable tension. Some people frowned, annoyed by the disruption. A few muttered under their breath, "Rude?" or "Can't they control their kid?" Others simply stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and disapproval. Alex's parents felt a wave of embarrassment wash over them. Sarah's heart sank. She knew this was a possibility, but she had so hoped Alex would be able to manage. Tom put his arm around Alex, pulling him close. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, trying to soothe him. "It's okay." But Alex wasn't listening. He was lost in the storm of his own senses. Sarah scanned the crowd, her face flushed. She saw the disapproving looks, the judgmental stares. She wanted to explain, to tell them that Alex couldn't help it, that he wasn't being deliberately disruptive. But she couldn't find the words. She just wanted to disappear. A woman standing nearby rolled her eyes and said loudly to her companion, "Some people just shouldn't bring their kids to these things." Sarah felt a sharp pang of hurt. She wanted to defend her son, to tell the woman how much Alex had been looking forward to this, how hard he had tried to be brave. But she bit her tongue, knowing that any response would only escalate the situation. Alex, oblivious to the reactions around him, continued to scream, his body shaking with distress. Tom held him tighter, rocking him gently back and forth. "Let's go find a quiet place." "Okay, Alex?" he said softly. "Let's go where it's not so loud." He started to lead Alex away from the crowd, his shoulders slumped with defeat. Sarah followed close behind, her eyes downcast, feeling like the worst parent in the world. The parade, which had held so much promise, had turned into a nightmare. At the head of the marching column, Sergeant Major Davies, a veteran of countless ceremonial events, heard the scream. His first instinct, honed by years of military discipline, was to maintain order, to ignore the disruption and continue the march. He was trained to focus, to remain impassive, to execute his duty regardless of external distractions. But something stopped him. It wasn't just the sound of the scream itself, but the raw emotion behind it, the palpable sense of distress. He glanced to the side, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw the boy, clearly overwhelmed, being comforted by his parents. He saw the looks of annoyance and judgment on the faces of some of the spectators. Sergeant Major Davies had a nephew with autism. He knew firsthand the challenges faced by children with sensory sensitivities and the misunderstandings they often encountered. He recognized the signs of sensory overload in the boy's frantic movements and desperate cries. He knew that a harsh reaction, a reprimand, or even a simple dismissal of the situation would only exacerbate the boy's distress and further humiliate his parents. He also knew that deviating from the strict protocol of the ceremonial march was a serious matter. But in that moment, he felt a stronger pull, a sense of empathy and a conviction that something needed to be done. He made a split-second decision. He subtly signaled to the drum major, the officer in charge of the music and the pace of the march. The drum major, a seasoned musician with years of experience, understood the sergeant major's nonverbal communication immediately. He raised his baton, signaling the band to slow down. The change was subtle at first. The drumbeat softened. The trumpets lowered their pitch. The guards, trained to react instantly to commands, adjusted their pace, their steps becoming slightly less forceful, less jarring. Sergeant Major Davies, still marching ramrod straight, made another small, almost imperceptible gesture. He slightly lowered his chin and offered a brief, downward nod, a gesture of reassurance and understanding. It was a gesture that wouldn't have been noticed by most, but it was directed specifically at Alex. He hoped, with that small movement, to communicate that he saw him, that he understood, that he wasn't judging him. He hoped to convey that everything was okay, that the world wasn't ending, that the noise would subside. The slowing of the march and the softening of the music had an immediate effect. The pounding in Alex's head began to lessen. The spinning sensation started to fade. He still felt overwhelmed, but the intensity of the sensory assault was diminishing. He noticed the change in the music first. It was still loud, but it wasn't as sharp as piercing. Then he saw the guard's steps slow down. The vibrations through the ground became less intense. He glanced up, his eyes still blurry with tears, and saw Sergeant Major Davies. He didn't understand the man's rank or his role in the march. He didn't know anything about military protocol or the significance of the event. But he saw the man's face, his calm, steady gaze, and the subtle nod of his head. In that moment, Alex felt a connection, a sense of understanding that transcended words. He felt seen, acknowledged, accepted. The scream that had been trapped in his throat began to dissipate. He took a shaky breath and then another. The world was still loud, still bright, still overwhelming, but it was a little bit less so. He wasn't completely calm, but he was calmer. He wasn't completely okay, but he was a little bit more okay. As the march continued at the adjusted pace, Alex found himself able to focus again, not on the overwhelming sensations but on the patterns. The rhythm of the drums, though softer, was still there. The synchronized movements of the guards, though slower, were still precise. He started to sway gently in time with the music, his small body finding a sense of comfort in the predictable beat. He reached out and took his mom's hand, squeezing it tightly. She squeezed back, her eyes filled with relief. She could see that he was still struggling, but he was managing. He was coping. He was being brave. Tom, standing on Alex's other side, smiled down at him. He pulled out Alex's noise-canceling headphones and offered them to him. "Want to try these, buddy?" he asked gently. Alex shook his head. He didn't want the headphones. He didn't want to shut out the world completely. He wanted to experience the march, even if it was still a little overwhelming. He wanted to be a part of it, not apart from it. He looked back at Sergeant Major Davies, who was still marching at the head of the column, his face impassive, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Alex didn't know why the man had slowed down the march. He didn't know why he had offered that small nod of reassurance. But he knew that the man had helped him. He knew that the man had seen him, had understood him, had accepted him. And that, more than anything, made all the difference. He still clutched his toy bus tightly in his hand, a tangible reminder of his comfort and his routine. But now, he also held something else. A feeling of hope, a sense of connection, and a belief that even in the midst of chaos and overwhelming sensations, there was still kindness and understanding to be found. He even managed a small, tentative smile. The ripple effect of Sergeant Major Davies's decision extended far beyond Alex and his family. As the crowd realized what was happening, As they understood the reason for the slowed pace and the softened music, a shift began to occur in their perception. The initial annoyance and judgment started to dissipate, replaced by something far more profound: empathy. People who had been frowning just moments before now wore expressions of understanding. Those who had been muttering under their breath now fell silent, their faces etched with a newfound awareness. They looked at Alex, not with disapproval, but with compassion. They saw him not as a disruptive force, but as a child struggling to cope with a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. A young woman standing nearby, who had initially rolled her eyes at Alex's scream, now reached into her bag and pulled out a pair of earplugs. She walked over to Sarah and offered them to her. "Just in case," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "They might help." Sarah, surprised by the gesture, accepted the earplugs with a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "That's very kind of you." An elderly gentleman, who had been complaining loudly about the disruption, approached Tom and patted him on the shoulder. "You're doing a good job, son," he said gruffly. "It's not easy." Tom nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. He had expected judgment, criticism, even anger. He hadn't expected kindness, understanding, or support. The crowd, initially a sea of anonymous faces, had transformed into a community of caring individuals. They had witnessed an act of compassion, and it had touched their hearts. They had seen a boy struggling, and they had responded with empathy and understanding. The air, once thick with tension, now hummed with a quiet sense of solidarity. Tears began to flow, not just from Sarah and Tom, but from others in the crowd. An elderly woman wiped her eyes with a tissue, remembering her own grandson who struggled with similar challenges. A young man, a soldier himself, stood at attention, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, recognizing the quiet courage it took for Sergeant Major Davies to make such a decision. The music, still playing softly, seemed to take on a new quality, a more tender, more compassionate tone. The guards, still marching in perfect formation, seemed to carry themselves with a new sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the impact they were having on the crowd. The event, which had begun as a display of military precision and national pride, had transformed into something far more meaningful, a celebration of human kindness, understanding, and acceptance. It was a reminder that even in the midst of formal ceremony and rigid protocol, there was always room for empathy and compassion. A little girl, no older than 5, reached out and took Alex's hand. He looked at her, surprised. She smiled at him, a bright, innocent smile that reached all the way to her eyes. He smiled back, a genuine smile this time, not a tentative one. He felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. He was no longer just Alex, the boy with autism who screamed at the parade. He was Alex, a part of something bigger, a part of a community that cared about him, that accepted him, that understood him. The sun shone down on the crowd, bathing them in a warm, golden light. The air was filled with the soft strains of the music, the gentle murmur of voices, and the quiet sobs of emotion. It was a moment of profound connection, a moment that would stay with everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. It was a moment when humanity shone through, illuminating the darkness with the light of compassion. Sarah and Tom watched in amazement as their son interacted with the little girl, his smile genuine and unguarded. They had rarely seen him so at ease in a public setting, so connected to others. They realized that Sergeant Major Davies' simple act of kindness had not only helped Alex, but had also opened up a whole new world of possibilities for him. They felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the Sergeant Major, but for everyone in the crowd who had shown them compassion and understanding. They had come to the parade expecting judgment and criticism, but they had found acceptance and support. They had come feeling isolated and alone, but they were now surrounded by a community of caring individuals. As the march continued, Sarah made eye contact with Sergeant Major Davies. He offered her another small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement and reassurance. She returned the nod, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She didn't need to say anything. He understood. Tom squeezed Alex's hand. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered, For being so brave. Alex looked up at his dad, his eyes shining with pride. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he knew that he had done something good. He knew that he had faced his fears and overcome his challenges. He knew that he had been accepted, not in spite of his autism, but because of it. As the last of the guards marched past, the crowd erupted in applause, not just for the soldiers, but for Sergeant Major Davies, for Alex, for Sarah and Tom, for everyone who had contributed to this extraordinary moment of human connection. It was an applause that echoed with gratitude, with hope, and with a profound sense of shared humanity. The parade, which had started with a scream of distress, ended with a roar of appreciation. The march was over, but the feeling of connection lingered. People lingered, chatting quietly, sharing smiles, and offering words of encouragement to Alex and his family. Sarah and Tom felt like they were floating on a cloud of gratitude and relief. As they started to walk away from the parade route, Alex suddenly stopped. He tugged on his mom's hand and pointed to a bus stop across the street. "Bus," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "Bus ride." Sarah and Tom exchanged a knowing glance. They had promised him an extra-long bus ride, and they weren't about to break that promise. They walked over to the bus stop and waited for the next bus to arrive. When the bus finally pulled up, Alex's eyes lit up. It was one of his favorite models, a sleek, modern bus with comfortable seats and large windows. He climbed aboard, his face beaming with joy. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Alex looked out the window, watching the world go by. He saw the familiar streets, the familiar buildings, the familiar faces. But everything looked different now, brighter, more vibrant, more full of possibility. He thought about Sergeant Major Davies, about the little girl who had held his hand, about the crowd who had shown him so much compassion. He realized that the world wasn't always a scary, overwhelming place. Sometimes it could be a place of kindness, understanding, and acceptance. He leaned his head against the window, his eyes closing. He was tired, but he was happy. He was grateful, he was hopeful, and he was content. He had faced his fears, overcome his challenges, and found his place in the world. And it all started with a scream and a simple act of kindness. He drifted off to sleep, dreaming of buses, of parades, and of a world where everyone was accepted for who they are. Sergeant Major Davies continued his career with the Guard, but he never forgot the day he slowed the march for a little boy. He often thought about Alex, wondering how he was doing and hoping that the small act of kindness had made a lasting difference in his life. He shared the story with his fellow soldiers, emphasizing the importance of empathy and understanding, even in the most rigid of circumstances. He encouraged them to look beyond the surface, to recognize the humanity in everyone, and to respond with compassion, even when it meant deviating from protocol. The story of the ceremonial march spread throughout the community, becoming a symbol of acceptance and inclusion. Schools used it as a teaching tool, emphasizing the importance of understanding and supporting individuals with autism and other special needs. Organizations dedicated to autism awareness shared the story widely, using it to inspire others to create a more compassionate and inclusive world. The event even led to changes in the way ceremonial marches were conducted. Organizers began to incorporate sensory-friendly elements into the events, such as designated quiet zones, reduced sound levels, and trained staff who could assist individuals with sensory sensitivities. The world didn't change overnight, of course. There were still challenges, still misunderstandings, still moments of judgment and intolerance. But the story of the boy who screamed at the parade served as a constant reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can have a profound impact, that even the most rigid of traditions can be adapted to accommodate those who are different, and that even in the midst of chaos and overwhelming sensations, there is always room for compassion, understanding, and acceptance. And all it took was one person to see another and to choose kindness. Years later, Alex would still remember the day he screamed at the parade. He wouldn't remember all the details, but he would remember the feeling of being overwhelmed, the kindness of the sergeant major, and the warmth of the little girl's hand in his. He grew up to be a happy, well-adjusted young man, with a passion for buses that never faded. He learned to navigate the world with his own unique set of strengths and challenges, and he inspired others with his resilience, his honesty, and his unwavering spirit. And every year, on the anniversary of the ceremonial march, he would take a bus ride, remembering the day that changed his life and the simple act of kindness that made all the difference. He would think about Sergeant Major Davies, about his parents, and about all the people who had shown him compassion and understanding. He knew that the world wasn't perfect, and that there would always be challenges to overcome. But he also knew that there was always hope, always kindness, and always the possibility for connection. And that, he realized, was more than enough. The end.